You know those scary noises you hear in the woods at night? Well, they're real. Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Tonight I have 7 true stories from people who went into the Appalachian forests after dark. They saw things that still give them nightmares. Weird creatures, creepy voices, and things following them in the darkness. These stories will freak you out. But before we start, please subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with your friends who love scary stuff. Tell me where you're watching from. Okay, guys, grab a blanket. Let's get started. I was 22 when I took a job doing trail maintenance for the state forestry department. Honestly, it wasn't my first choice for summer work, but it paid decent money, and I needed every penny I could get for college in the fall. The job was pretty straightforward. Clear fallen trees, fix damaged sections of hiking trails, basic stuff like that. Most of the time I worked with a crew, but sometimes they'd send me out alone to handle the smaller jobs. That's how I ended up on Thin Bone Ridge that August, and looking back now, I really wish they'd sent someone with me. The assignment seemed simple enough. There was a 2-mile section of trail on the ridge that had gotten pretty torn up during some bad storms earlier that summer. Trees down, washouts from heavy rain, the usual mess. My supervisor told me it was probably a 2-day job, maybe 3 if I ran into complications. I loaded up my truck with all the tools I'd need, chainsaw, shovels, pick, rope, all that, and headed up the mountain early on a Tuesday morning. Thin Bone Ridge isn't exactly a popular hiking spot. It's not one of those scenic trails you see in tourism brochures. The ridge runs along the backside of the mountain, and the trail there is mostly used by hunters and the occasional backpacker looking for solitude. The forest is thick, mostly oak and pine, and it gets pretty dark under the canopy even during the day. Cell service is basically non-existent once you get more than a mile up the trail. I started working around 8 in the morning, and honestly, the first day went pretty well. I cleared 3 good-sized trees that had fallen across the trail and fixed a couple spots where the rain had washed out the path. The work was hard, but not too complicated, and I was making good time. I figured I'd probably finish the whole job in 2 days instead of 3. By the time I looked at my watch again, it was already past 6 in the evening. The sun was starting to get low behind the trees, and I knew I had maybe an hour of decent light left. I was about 1.5 miles from where I'd parked my truck, and the smart thing would have been to pack up and head back. But I was feeling good about the progress I was making, and there was one more big tree I wanted to tackle before calling it a day. That tree turned out to be more of a pain than I expected. It was a massive oak, probably been growing there for 60 or 70 years before the storm knocked it down. The trunk was easily 3 feet across, and it had fallen at an awkward angle that made it tricky to cut. I spent longer on it than I should have, and by the time I finished cutting it into sections I could move. The sun was setting and the forest was getting dark fast. I stood there for a minute, looking back down the trail toward my truck. The path disappeared into the shadows maybe 50 feet away, and I couldn't see much beyond that. I had a flashlight, but hiking 1.5 miles down a rough trail in the dark while carrying all my tools didn't sound appealing. Plus, I was pretty tired after working all day. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. I decided to camp out for the night and finish the job in the morning. I had a small backpacking tent in my truck for situations just like this, along with a sleeping bag and some basic camping gear. It wouldn't be the most comfortable night, but I'd slept in worse places. I set up my little tent in a clearing about 20 yards off the trail where the ground was relatively level. Got a small campfire going and heated up a can of chili for dinner. The forest was quiet, which wasn't unusual for that area. No traffic noise, no people around for miles. Just me and the trees and the crackling of the fire. While I was eating, I started noticing something weird about some of the trees around my campsite. At first I thought it was just shadows from the firelight playing tricks on me, but when I got up to look closer, I realized what I was seeing was real. There were marks carved into the bark of several trees, spirals that started down near the base and curved up the trunk as far as I could see into the darkness above. The marks looked fresh, like they'd been made recently. The bark was still pale where it had been stripped away, and there was sap oozing from some of the cuts. But here's the thing that bothered me. These spirals went way up high, 30 or 40 feet up the trunks. I'm talking higher than anyone could reach, even with a ladder. and they were perfectly formed, like someone had used some kind of tool to make them, not like animal claw marks or anything like that. I walked around the clearing with my flashlight, checking more trees. The spiral marks were everywhere, on maybe a dozen different trees that I could see, all fresh, all impossibly high up the trunks. I started thinking maybe it was some kind of equipment mark, like from tree cutters or something, but that didn't make sense either. There was no logging activity in this area, and besides, what kind of equipment would make marks like that? I went back to my fire and tried to put it out of my mind. Probably just some weird natural thing I'd never seen before. But as I sat there finishing my dinner, I kept glancing up at the trees around me, trying to see where those spiral marks ended. That's when I saw one being made. I was looking up at a big pine tree maybe 30 feet away when the bark just started splitting in that same spiral pattern. No wind, no animal, nothing touching the tree at all. The bark just peeled away in a long, curving line that went up and up until it disappeared into the darkness above. I could hear it happening, this soft, tearing sound, like someone slowly ripping paper. I stood up so fast I knocked over my cup of coffee. The spiral kept forming, moving up the tree. A trunk at a steady pace. It took maybe 10 seconds to complete, and then everything went quiet again. I just stood there staring at the tree, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. That's when I noticed the shadow. It was cast by my campfire, stretched out across the ground toward the tree line. But it wasn't my shadow. This one was way too tall and thin to be human. The shape looked like a person, but stretched out like taffy. Long, stick-like legs, arms that seemed to reach almost to the ground, and a head that was elongated and wrong-looking. I spun around to see what was casting the shadow, but there was nothing there, just empty air between me and the fire. When I looked back at the ground, the shadow was moving, taking long, impossibly wide steps across the clearing. Each stride had to be 10 feet or more. Then I saw another shadow and another. They seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, all of them moving in that same strange, stretched-out way. Within a few minutes, there were maybe a dozen of these shadows moving around my campsite, but I couldn't see anything casting them. It was like watching a puppet show where all the puppets were invisible. My fire started flickering, even though there wasn't any wind. The flames danced and jumped, and the smoke began swirling in patterns that didn't make sense. That's when I started seeing them more clearly. In the smoke, I could make out translucent shapes moving around me. They were only visible when the smoke passed through them or around them, like looking at something through frosted glass. One of them walked directly through the smoke from my fire, and I got a good look at it. I wish I hadn't. It was about 15 feet tall, maybe taller. The body was human-shaped but stretched out like someone had grabbed it by the head and feet and pulled. Every bone was visible through skin that looked thin as paper, and the arms hung down almost to the ground even though the thing was standing upright. The fingers were at least 2 feet long each, with way too many joints, like they'd been broken and healed wrong multiple times. But the face was the worst part. It was elongated, pulled vertically like the rest of the body. The eyes were these long, oval shapes turned sideways, and the mouth was just a slit that went from one side of the face to the other. Had to be at least a foot long. When it realized I was looking at it, the thing smiled. The mouth opened up and split that elongated face from ear to chin. I could see teeth inside, lots of them, all different sizes and shapes like they'd been pulled and stretched too. The thing reached toward me with those impossible arms. The fingers were so long, they could have wrapped around me twice. Where they touched my tent, the fabric started stretching like rubber, getting longer and thinner. I watched my sleeping bag do the same thing, going from normal size to maybe 10 feet long in just a few seconds. Then I felt it myself. This pulling sensation like someone had hooked cables to my arms and legs and was trying to stretch me out. I could feel my spine popping, my bones creaking, actually getting taller. I looked down at my hands and watched my fingers getting longer, the joints spreading apart. All around me, the stretched men were closing in. Their voices sounded like wind blowing through pipes, hollow and distant. "Join the tall ones," they kept saying. "We see over the mountains, through the clouds. Come up high with us." I could feel my legs stretching, my pants starting to tear at the seams. I was already 7 feet tall and still growing. The stretched men seemed happy about this, nodding their elongated heads and reaching out to welcome me. I realized that pretty soon I'd be just like them, impossibly tall and thin, visible only in smoke and shadows. That's when I panicked and knocked over my camp stove. The gas line got pinched when the stove hit the ground and liquid fuel sprayed everywhere. When it hit fire, the whole clearing lit up like a bomb went off. The explosion cleared all the smoke away instantly, and the stretched men just vanished. 1 second they were there, the next second I was alone, but I wasn't back to normal. I looked down at myself and I was still stretched out, maybe 8 feet tall and thin as a rail. My clothes were hanging off me like rags, and when I tried to walk, I kept stumbling because my new legs were so long and awkward. It took me hours to get back to my truck. I must have fallen 50 times, tripping over my own feet or getting tangled up in brush that used to be the right height for me. My new body didn't work right. Everything felt wrong and unbalanced. By the time I got back to town, it was almost dawn. I'd shrunk some during the night, but not back to normal. I used to be 5'10". Now I'm 6'8", and that's where I've stayed for the past 3 years. I went to doctors, had x-rays, blood tests, every kind of scan they could think of. They all said the same thing. My bones had somehow grown overnight. The medical term they used was acute longitudinal skeletal extension, which is just a fancy way of saying they had no idea what happened to me. One doctor suggested it might have been some kind of rare growth hormone disorder, but he admitted he'd never seen anything like it in an adult. I never went back to finish that job on Thin Bone Ridge. Told my supervisor I'd gotten sick and couldn't work anymore. Found a different job in town, something that kept me away from the mountains. But sometimes, usually on foggy mornings or when there's a lot of smoke in the air, I can see them watching me. The stretched men. They're always there at the edge of my vision, those long shadows moving between trees or buildings. And I can feel that pull again, that urge to stretch out even more, to join them up there where they can see everything. I don't talk about this much. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But sometimes I catch myself looking up at tall buildings or mountains, wondering what it would be like to see the world from that height. And on those days, I have to remind myself that some things are better left alone, even if they're calling your name. I was 23 when I lost my job at the distribution center in Louisville. Not gonna lie, it hit me pretty hard. I'd been there for 2 years, thought I was doing decent work, but they cut a whole bunch of us when some new automated system came in. My girlfriend had just broken up with me the month before, and honestly, I was feeling pretty lost about everything. My buddy Jake suggested I take some time to clear my head, maybe do some camping by myself. I'd never done solo camping before, but the idea of getting away from everything for a few days sounded perfect. I picked Bleachers Hollow in eastern Kentucky because honestly, nobody ever goes there. I'd found it on some old hiking forum where a guy mentioned it was completely off the beaten path. No cell service, no other campers, just pure wilderness. That's exactly what I wanted. I loaded up my little Honda Civic with my camping gear, threw in some hot dogs and canned beans, and drove out there on a Thursday morning in late September. The weather was supposed to be perfect all week. The drive took about 3 hours, and the last part was this old logging road that got rougher and rougher as I went. I kept thinking I should turn around, but I was determined to make it work. Finally, the road got so bad I was worried about scraping my oil pan, so I parked the car and decided to hike the rest of the way. According to my map, there was supposed to be a decent clearing about 3 miles up the old road. The hike wasn't too bad, actually. It was one of those perfect fall days where the air is crisp, but the sun feels warm on your face. I had my backpack with my tent and sleeping bag, plus a smaller day pack with food and water. The trees were just starting to change colors, and everything smelled like leaves and that clean mountain air. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed to get my head straight. I found the sea leering around 5 p.m., and it was better than I'd hoped. Maybe 50 yards across, mostly flat, with a ring of stones that someone had used for a fire pit before. There was even a little creek running along one edge where I could get fresh water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and had my little camp ready to go by 7 p.m. while there was still plenty of daylight. I made a fire, cooked up some hot dogs on a stick, and just sat there listening to the forest settle in for the night. You know how woods sound at dusk, all the daytime birds getting quiet, then the night sounds starting up. Owls calling back and forth, little rustling noises in the leaves, that kind of thing. It was peaceful. I remember thinking maybe I should do this kind of thing more often. Around 10 p.m., I was getting ready to bank the fire and turn in when I started hearing this sound from the woods. It was this wet, cracking noise, like someone breaking chicken bones, but louder and more deliberate. At first I figured it was a bear or maybe a big raccoon working on some carcass it had found. Nothing too unusual about that. I threw another log on the fire and kept listening. The sound kept getting closer though, and it seemed to be moving around my camp in a circle. Always that same wet cracking, like bones being snapped and split open. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to see what was out there, but all I could make out was dark trees and brush. The sound would stop whenever I pointed the light toward it, then start up again from a different direction. Then I saw eyeshine about 30 feet out from my fire. You know how animal eyes reflect light at night? These were like that, but they were way too low to the ground. Like whatever it was crawling or hunched over. I kept my flashlight on the spot, but the eyes just blinked out, and the cracking sound moved to another part of the woods. That's what. Then something flew out of the darkness and landed right next to my fire. It was a deer leg bone, a big one, split right down the middle. The marrow was completely gone, sucked clean, and there were tooth marks all along where it had been cracked open. I picked it up and looked at it in my flashlight beam. The bone was still warm. More bones started flying into my camp from different directions. A raccoon skull with the back cracked open. Some kind of leg bone from a rabbit or squirrel, also split and empty. All of them had these weird tooth marks that didn't look like any animal I knew about. They were too small, and there were too many of them, like someone had used a handful of needles to scrape out every bit of marrow. I swept my flashlight around the edge of the clearing and caught movement behind a fallen log. Something pale was moving along the ground, staying low, and when I focused the beam on it, I could see it was roughly human-shaped, but all wrong. It was moving on all fours, but its joints bent in directions that made my stomach turn. The elbows bent backward like a bird's wings, and the knees seemed to hinge sideways. When it moved, it was smooth and fluid like a spider, but big as a person. Its fingers were the worst part I could see from my distance. They were way too long with too many knuckles, and they kept flexing and cracking like someone popping their joints over and over. Every time the fingers moved, I heard that wet, bone-cracking sound I'd been hearing all night. When it got close enough for me to really see it in my flashlight beam, I saw its face. The jaw was unhinged like a snake's, hanging open way too wide. Inside its mouth were rows and rows of thin teeth, like sewing needles, going back deep into its throat. As I watched, it picked up a stick about as thick as my thumb, bit down on it, and started sucking. I could hear the wood cracking and splintering as it drew out whatever was inside. That's when two more of them crawled out from different parts of the woods. They moved with that same horrible spider-like grace, joint, bending wrong, fingers constantly flexing. They didn't make any normal animal sounds, just those clicking noises and the constant bone cracking from their joints. It was like they were talking to each other, but not with voices. The first one got brave and came closer to my fire. In the light, I could see its skin was translucent like wax paper. I could actually see its veins underneath, dark and twisted, and I could see bones through its skin. But the bones were all wrong too. Cracked and healed, crooked, bent at angles that didn't make sense. Like every bone in its body had been broken and set wrong on purpose. It reached toward my leg with those multi-jointed fingers, and I panicked. I kicked a burning log from my fire right at it, sending sparks and embers flying everywhere. The thing made this sound like metal scraping against concrete, a shriek that went right through my bones. All three of them froze and stared at the scattered fire, then looked at the lighter in my hand. They started backing away, but one of them grabbed the strap of my backpack as I was trying to stand up. Its grip was insane. It crushed the plastic buckle like it was made of paper. I had to slip my arms out of the pack straps and just abandon it. I could hear them behind me, ripping through my stuff, making those clicking sounds like they were looking for something specific. I ran for the tree line, but they followed. I could hear them galloping through the woods behind me, that horrible sound of joints cracking and popping with every step. They moved faster than me, but they kept stopping. I'd hear them pause, then that wet cracking sound, like they couldn't help themselves from stopping to crack and eat sticks and branches they found along the way. When I made it back to my car, I could see they'd been there before me. The windows were covered in greasy handprints, but each handprint had too many fingers. Way too many. My doors were standing open and the seats were torn apart like they'd been looking for something. The foam stuffing was scattered everywhere. I got the engine started, but before I could get moving, they climbed up onto my hood, 3 of them looking right at me through the windshield with those needle-filled mouths hanging open. Their weight cracked the glass and they started scraping their teeth against it, making this horrible grinding sound. I floored it anyway. They clung on for about half a mile, their fingers making scratching sounds on the metal, before they finally lost their grip and fell off. But one of them got its fingers caught in my door as it fell. The fingers ripped clean off but kept moving on my floorboard, twitching like earthworms. They didn't have bones inside, just cartilage and that same translucent skin. I threw them out the window and heard shrieking from the forest behind me. I drove straight to the emergency room in the nearest town and told them I'd been camping and thought I might have been exposed to rabies. The doctor found puncture wounds on my ankle that I hadn't even felt. Perfect little needle marks in a circle like something had bitten me to test the density of my bones. They gave me the rabies shots just to be safe, and when they did x-rays to make sure nothing was broken, they found hairline fractures in that ankle bone that hadn't been there before. I moved back in with my parents in Ohio after that. Found a job at a factory that keeps me indoors, nowhere near any forests. I still have dreams about those backward joints and needle teeth. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and have to feel my arms and legs to make sure all my bones are still solid and in the right places. I never went back to get my camping gear. As far as I know, it's still up there in Bleacher's Hollow. And honestly, I hope it stays there. I hope nobody else is dumb enough to go camping alone in places where nobody ever goes. Because now I know why nobody ever goes there. Those things are still out there, still looking for marrow. And next time, they might not be satisfied with just a taste. I was 29 when I decided to start my mushroom foraging business, selling to fancy restaurants around Asheville and Charlotte. I'd been hiking these mountains my whole life, knew them better than most people know their own neighborhood. My dad taught me which mushrooms were safe, which ones would kill you, and which ones the city folk would pay good money for. It wasn't exactly getting rich, but it was honest work, and I liked being outdoors instead of stuck in some office somewhere. The thing about mushroom hunting is timing. You can't just wander around hoping to find something good. You need to know when and where to look. Most people think you just go out during the day with a basket, but that's amateur stuff. The real money makers, the ones that make restaurant chefs get excited, a lot of them are bioluminescent. They glow in the dark. So I did most of my serious foraging at night with a UV flashlight and my regular gear. Black Hollow was one of my regular spots, about 40 minutes drive from my place. Then another 20-minute hike up an old logging road. It's not on any official trail maps, just something the timber companies cut back in the 80s and then abandoned. The forest had grown back thick around it, and most hikers never bothered going that deep into the woods. That made it perfect for me. Less competition, better specimens, and the mushrooms there seemed bigger and healthier than anywhere else I'd found. I'd been going to Black Hollow for about 3 years without any problems. Sure, it was a little creepy at night, but I grew up in these mountains. You learn to tell the difference between normal forest sounds and something worth worrying about. Bears make noise when they move. Coyotes yip and howl. Even wildcats give you some warning. The forest in Black Hollow was always dead quiet, but I figured that just meant the mushrooms had less competition from animals eating them. This particular night was in early October, perfect mushroom weather. Cool and damp from some rain we'd had the week before, but not so wet that everything was rotting. I parked my truck at the bottom of the logging road around 9:30, grabbed my gear, and started the hike up. UV flashlight, regular LED flashlight as backup, my collection basket, a good knife, and some plastic bags for the really delicate ones. The hike up was normal. Same fallen log I always stepped over, same boulder I used as a landmark, same bend in the path where you could see the ridgeline through the trees. I made it to my usual starting point around 10:15 and switched on the UV light. That's when I saw them. About 30 feet off the old road, there was this cluster of mushrooms I'd never seen before. And I mean never. I've got field guides. I've been doing this for years. I know what grows in these mountains. These were something completely different. They were about the size of dinner plates, growing in a perfect circle around the base of a dead oak tree. But here's the thing that got my attention. They were glowing. Not just reflecting my UV light like most bioluminescent mushrooms, but actually producing their own light. Bright blue, pulsing like a heartbeat. I'd never seen anything like it. I should have been more careful. Looking back now, I should have taken some pictures, maybe collected just one small sample, and gotten out of there to do research. But all I could think about was how much some chef would pay for something this unique. I mean, mushrooms that glow blue and pulse like they're alive? That's the kind of thing that gets you written up in food magazines. I walked over to get a closer look, and that's when things started going wrong. As soon as I got within maybe 10 feet of them, they started releasing spores. Not like normal mushroom, where you have to disturb them or step on them. These just started puffing out clouds of glowing dust like they knew I was there. The spores hung in the air like glowing fog, drifting toward me on a breeze that shouldn't have existed because the night was completely still. I tried to back away, but I was already breathing some of it in. It tasted like copper pennies mixed with dirt, and it made my mouth go numb almost immediately. Within about 30 seconds, I started feeling dizzy, like when you stand up too fast, except it kept getting worse instead of going away. That's when my vision started changing. At first I thought maybe I was having some kind of allergic reaction. Everything looked sharper, but wrong somehow. Colors were more intense, especially blues and greens. But then I started seeing things that definitely weren't there before. Underground, beneath my feet, I could see these glowing lines spreading out through the forest floor like some kind of subway map. Thin threads of blue light connecting tree to tree, rock to rock, stretching out in every direction as far as I could see. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like looking at the nervous system of something huge and alive. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at this network of light under the ground, trying to figure out what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the shapes moving between the trees. People. At least, they used to be people. The first one I saw clearly was about 20 feet away, standing next to a birch tree. In the regular light from my LED flashlight, it looked almost normal. Just a person in dark clothes, maybe another night hiker who got lost. But when I switched back to the UV light, I could see what had really happened to them. They were covered in mushrooms. Not wearing them, not carrying them, growing them. Shelf fungi were coming right out of their shoulders and back like some kind of armor. Their hair had been replaced by tiny white mushrooms that moved slightly in the breeze. Where their eyes should have been, there were these round puffball mushrooms, smooth and white and about the size of ping pong balls. But here's the thing that really got to me. They were still human enough that you could tell they used to be a person. The basic shape was right, the way they stood. Even some of their facial features were still there underneath all the fungus. It was like seeing someone you might have known, if half their face hadn't been replaced by mushrooms. This first one turned to look at me, and I realized it knew I was there. It opened what was left of its mouth, but instead of words, spores came out. Glowing spores that formed shapes in the air, like smoke signals or something. The spores made pictures. I don't know how else to describe it. They showed me images. People hiking through the forest, breathing in the blue spores, sitting down to rest and never getting back up. The spores showed me the mushrooms growing from their skin, spreading through their bodies, connecting them to that underground network I could see. That's when I looked down at my own hands and saw the tiny white threads starting to come out of my pores. They were so small I almost missed them, like little white hairs growing from my skin. But when I tried to brush them off, I could feel them. They had roots going down into my flesh, and pulling on them hurt like hell. I tried scratching them off with my knife, but they just grew back faster. More of the mushroom people started coming out from behind trees, all in different stages. Some still looked mostly human, with just a few shelf fungi growing from their necks or arms. Others were so covered in mushrooms you could barely tell what they used to be. One woman was just a vague human shape made out of brackets and moss, but she was still trying to walk upright like a person. They surrounded me, but they moved slow and careful, like they were being gentle. Their spore talk showed me more pictures, me joining them, becoming part of their network, helping tend the forest floor. They made it look peaceful, like I'd be part of something bigger and more important than just collecting mushrooms for restaurants. I could feel it happening to me. The little mushrooms growing from my skin were spreading, and my thoughts were getting fuzzy. It was like being really tired, but also like my mind was connecting to something else. I started understanding things I shouldn't have known, how deep the fungal network went, how old it was, how it had been in these mountains since before the trees, before the animals, before anything. My legs started moving without me deciding to move them. The mushroom people were leading me deeper into the forest, to a grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle. In the middle of the circle, there were more people in various stages of transformation. Some were just sitting there with mushrooms sprouting from their clothes. Others were so far gone they looked more like walking mushroom gardens than people. But one of them, a woman who was maybe about half transformed, managed to get my attention. She still had enough human left in her to move on her own, and she used her spore talk to show me something the others didn't want me to see. Fire. She showed me images of fire burning the mushrooms, showed me people using lighters and matches to burn the fungus off their skin before it could take hold completely. It hurt them, scarred them, but it worked. Fire was the only thing that could stop it. I still had my lighter in my pocket. I pulled it out and started burning the mushrooms growing on my hands and arms. The pain was incredible, like burning yourself on purpose, but I could feel the fungus letting go. The little white threads pulled back into my skin, and my thoughts started clearing up. The mushroom people around me started making this sound, not with their mouths, but by releasing spores. Angry red spores that burned my lungs when I breathed them in. They tried to stop me, but they moved too slowly, like they were rooted to their spots. I set fire to some of the smaller mushrooms in the grove, and the flames spread faster than I expected. The whole underground network lit up. I could see the blue lines under the forest floor turning red, then white, then going out section by section. The mushroom people were connected to it somehow, because they started collapsing as the network burned. I ran. Didn't matter which direction, just away from the grove and the burning fungus and those people who weren't really people anymore. I could hear the fire spreading behind me, crackling through the dry leaves and dead wood. But underneath that, I could hear something else, a sound like screaming, but coming from under the ground. I made it back to my truck around 3 a.m, burned and scratched up, but mostly human again. Drove straight home and didn't stop until I was in my own driveway. But I wasn't completely clean. Even now, 5 years later, when it rains hard, tiny mushrooms start growing from my skin. Just small, white ones. Nothing like what I saw that night, but enough to remind me of what almost happened. I have to burn them off with a lighter every time, and I've got scars all over my arms and chest from it. I never went back to Black Hollow. Don't even drive on that road anymore if I can help it. I still do mushroom foraging, but only during the day now, and never alone. I stick to the well-traveled trails where other people go, places where the fungus probably can't get a foothold. Sometimes I wonder about those people in the grove, whether any of them made it out when the fire spread. But honestly, I try not to think about it too much. I've got enough problems dealing with the mushrooms that still try to grow on me every time it storms. I never reported it to anyone. Who would believe it? But if you're ever out hiking in the mountains at night and you see mushrooms glowing blue, do yourself a favor, turn around and walk away. Some things in the forest are better left alone. I was 26 when I decided to drive home from my great-aunt's funeral in West Virginia instead of flying back to Virginia like everyone else in my family. Honestly, I just needed some time alone to process everything. Aunt Ruth had been like a second grandmother to me, and seeing her in that casket wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to every family gathering for the past 20 years just hit me harder than I expected. My GPS kept insisting I could save 2 hours by taking some mountain highway instead of the interstate, and to be fair, I wasn't in any hurry to get back to my empty apartment and the stack of bills waiting on my kitchen table. I work in IT support, which basically means I fix other people's computer problems all day, and after spending 3 days listening to family stories and eating casseroles, the idea of sitting in normal highway traffic for 6 hours sounded awful. So around 10 p.m., I took the mountain route. The GPS lady kept telling me to turn onto smaller and smaller roads, each one getting more winding and isolated than the last. By the time I was driving through something called Crow's Gap, it was past midnight and I hadn't seen another car in probably 40 minutes. Just me, my headlights, and endless pine trees on both sides of this narrow 2-lane road. That's when I saw her. An old woman was standing on the side of the road, waving her arms like she needed help. She looked hurt or confused, the way elderly people sometimes do when they get turned around. My first instinct was to keep driving because, honestly, stopping for strangers on a deserted mountain road at midnight isn't exactly smart. But something about her made me slow down. She looked exactly like my grandma, not similar to my grandma. Not like she reminded me of her. I'm talking exactly like her. Same gray hair pulled back in that loose bun, same floral print dress, same little cardigan sweater. Even from 50 feet away, I could see she was wearing Grandma's thick-rimmed glasses and that cameo brooch she never took off. The thing is, my grandma died 3 years ago. I was at her funeral. I helped carry her casket. She was buried wearing that exact outfit. I pulled over about 50 feet past the woman and looked in my rearview mirror. She was walking toward my car, but something about the way she moved wasn't right. Her steps were too long, like someone trying to operate a body they didn't understand. Her arms swung out of sync with her legs, and her head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. When she got to my driver's side window, she tapped on the glass with her knuckles. I could see Grandma's wedding ring, the thin gold band she'd worn for 62 years. She even tapped in the same pattern Grandma always used. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more taps. I rolled the window down halfway, and that's when I saw her face up close. The skin didn't fit right. It was like looking at someone wearing a mask of my grandmother's face, but the mask was too loose. The skin bunched up around her eyes and sagged near her ears. When she smiled, the corners of her mouth pulled in directions that didn't match the movement of her lips. "Let me in, sweetheart," she said in my grandmother's exact voice, with that same soft West Virginia accent. "I'm so cold out here." That's when I noticed her neck. The skin was loose and wrinkled, but not in the normal way old people's skin looks. It was loose, like a shirt that's too big, and I could see something dark and wet moving underneath it, something that shifted independently from her face. I hit the gas. She grabbed my side mirror as I pulled away. The whole thing ripped off my car, but her hand came with it, just the skin, like a latex glove, still gripping the mirror. Underneath was some thing black and hard-looking, like beetle shell or wet leather. In my remaining mirror, I watched her face slide off completely. Something was emerging from underneath, something that definitely wasn't human. I was doing about 60 on that winding mountain road, probably stupid fast, but I needed to get away from whatever that thing was. About 3 miles down the road, I saw someone else standing in the middle of the pavement, my dad. He'd been dead for 5 years, cancer, but there he was wearing the same dark blue suit we'd buried him in. He was just standing there in my headlights like he was waiting for me. I swerved around him, but he jumped at my car as I passed. The impact knocked him right onto my hood, and his face stuck to my windshield for a few seconds before sliding off like wet latex. Through the glass, I could see what was underneath. Some kind of insect-like head with compound eyes and clicking mandibles that definitely weren't human. More figures started appearing on the road ahead. I recognized every single one of them. My Uncle Dave, who died in a mining accident when I was 12. My high school friend Kelly, who overdosed sophomore year of college. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who'd had a heart attack last spring. All of them dead. All of them wearing clothes I remembered from their funerals. All of them walking wrong, with skin that hung loose at the joints, and I could see dark shapes moving underneath. They formed a line across the road. I had no choice but to drive straight through them. The impact was awful. It was like hitting bags of water. They burst, covering my windshield with thick black liquid that immediately started smoking and eating through the glass. The skin suits stuck to my car like wet paper, faces pressed against my windows, but they were empty now, just hollow skins with eye holes staring at nothing. Through my dissolving windshield, I could see the black things that had been wearing those faces. They scattered into the forest on either side of the road, making this chittering noise like insects talking to each other. I could hear them regrouping in the trees, probably finding new skins to wear. My car started making terrible noises. The black fluid had gotten into the engine somehow, and I could smell something burning that definitely wasn't normal car smells. The engine died completely about a mile later, and I coasted to a stop on the shoulder. I grabbed my phone and started running. They followed me. I could hear them crashing through the trees on both sides of the road, wearing new faces now. I caught glimpses of hikers, park rangers, even children, all of them moving wrong, all of them with skin that didn't quite fit. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes. Finally, I saw lights ahead, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The attendant behind the counter looked up when I burst through the door, and I immediately saw that his face was wrong too. The skin was bunched up around his collar like it was too big, and when he smiled, I could see something dark and wet behind his teeth. I ran past him into the bathroom and locked the door. I called 911, but when the dispatcher answered, she spoke in my mother's voice. My mother, who was very much alive and living in Richmond. But it was definitely her voice asking me about the nature of my emergency. I hung up and stayed in that bathroom until dawn, listening to scratching sounds outside the door and soft tapping on the walls. Sometimes I heard voices I recognized calling my name, asking me to come out, telling me everything was fine. When the sun came up, everything went quiet. A real state trooper found me around 7 a.m. He said they'd gotten reports of incidents all night long. Abandoned cars, people running through the woods, strange sightings. He seemed tired, like this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with something like this. My car was still Wal's. Here I'd left it, but it was full of shed skins. They looked like snake skins, but human-shaped. Just empty husks piled in my back seat and draped over my steering wheel. The black fluid had dissolved most of my engine block, leaving just twisted metal and plastic. The state trooper gave me a ride to the nearest town, and I took a Greyhound bus home. I never went back to get my car. I told my insurance company it was stolen. That was 8 years ago. I still live in the same apartment, still work the same job, but I don't drive through mountains anymore. Ever. I take the interstate everywhere, even if it adds hours to my trip. Sometimes I see people whose skin doesn't fit quite right, loose around the neck, bunched up near the eyes, moving in ways that don't match their facial expressions. When that happens, I turn around and walk the other way. I still don't know what those things were or why they were wearing the faces of my dead relatives. But I know they're still out there, somewhere in those mountains, probably wearing new faces they've found. Maybe even faces of people who are still alive. I just hope they never decide to wear mine. I was 24 when I decided to make studying bugs my whole career, which honestly sounds pretty boring when I say it out loud. But I was working on my graduate degree in entomology at the university, and I'd gotten this grant to study firefly synchronization patterns in the Appalachian mountains. The whole idea was that fireflies in certain areas all flash at the exact same time, like they're talking to each other or something. My professor thought it might lead to some breakthrough about insect communication. So there I was, driving my beat-up Honda through the mountains of eastern Kentucky with a bunch of equipment in my back seat. I ended up staying at this old motel near Black Creek, about 40 miles from the nearest real town. The place was called Mountain View Lodge, though there wasn't much of a view except for trees and more trees. It was October, way past tourist season, so I was literally the only guest there. The owner was this older guy named Carl who seemed happy enough to have someone paying for a room. He told me the area was perfect for what I was studying, said the fireflies there did things he'd never seen anywhere else. That should have been my first clue something was off, but I was just excited to get started on my research. The first couple days were pretty normal. I'd head out around sunset with my equipment, set up my cameras and sensors in different spots around the valley, and just wait. Black Creek ran right through the middle of everything, making this perfect little ecosystem where thousands of fireflies would come out every night. During the day, I'd analyze the footage and data I'd collected. The synchronization was incredible, better than anything I'd seen in my research. These bugs were flashing in perfect unison across the entire valley, like someone was conducting an orchestra. But on my third night there, something changed. I was set up on this little hill overlooking the creek, probably around 9 p.m., when the fireflies started their usual show. At first, everything looked normal. Thousands of tiny lights blinking on and off together, creating this amazing wave pattern across the trees. But then I started noticing the pattern was more complex than I'd realized. The lights weren't just flashing randomly, they were forming shapes. Actual shapes, spreading across the entire valley. I thought maybe I was just seeing things, you know how your brain tries to make patterns out of random stuff. But I kept watching, and the shapes got clearer. They looked almost like letters, or symbols of some kind. I started recording everything, thinking this could be the discovery that made my whole career. The fireflies were creating these complex formations, holding them for several seconds, then shifting into new patterns. That's when I saw it. Clear as day, spelled out in thousands of tiny lights across the darkness. We see you. I just stood there staring. There was no way this was natural. No way random insects could coordinate something like that. But there it was, written in light right in front of me. The message held for maybe 10 seconds. Then all the fireflies went dark at once. Complete darkness, like someone had just turned off every light in the world. The silence hit me next. I hadn't even realized how much noise there'd been until it stopped. All the normal forest sounds, the crickets, the night birds, everything just went quiet. But then I heard something else. This low buzzing sound, not coming from insects, but from somewhere deeper, like it was rising up from the ground itself. I could feel it in my feet, this vibration running through the earth. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw the trees moving, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind. The bark was rippling like water, like something was moving underneath it. I stepped closer to get a better look, and a whole section of bark just split open like a door. Yellow jackets poured out, hundreds of them streaming out of this hole in the tree. But they weren't flying around randomly like insects do. They moved in formation, organizing themselves into shapes. I watched them form into a column, roughly human-shaped, just standing there in front of the tree. More trees started opening up around the valley. Wasps, hornets, different kinds of bees, all of them moving like they shared the same brain. The buzzing got louder, and I swear it started forming words. Not words I could understand clearly, but the rhythm and tone sounded like speech, like they were trying to talk. The swarm people, that's the only way I can describe them, started moving closer to where I was standing. There were dozens of them now, all made entirely of insects, but holding human shapes perfectly. One of them reached out toward me. I should have run right then, but I was too shocked to move. It touched my arm, and I felt thousands of tiny legs crawling across my skin. Where they touched me, everything went numb. Then my skin started opening up. Little holes appeared on my arm, perfectly round like honeycomb, and things started crawling out of them. Not blood, tiny insects, from inside me. I looked down at my arm in horror. I'd been infected somehow without even knowing it. These things had been growing inside me, probably since I'd arrived. The swarm people moved closer, and their shapes became more detailed. I could see faces now, made of carefully arranged insects. One of them looked familiar, like the motel owner Carl. Another one looked like this hiker I'd passed on the trail my first day there. That's when the real Carl stepped out from behind one of the trees. At least, it looked like Carl, but his eyes were gone, replaced with these hexagonal compound structures like insect eyes. Holes covered his skin, and bugs crawled in and out of them constant. Why? He didn't seem bothered by it at all. "It doesn't hurt," he said, but his voice had this weird buzzing quality to it. "We're all connected now, part of something bigger." The holes in my arm were spreading, more insects emerging from inside me. I could feel them in my chest, crawling up my throat. I coughed and dozens of gnats flew out of my mouth. The swarm people surrounded me completely now, all of them buzzing in perfect harmony. The sound was hypnotic and I felt my thoughts getting fuzzy. Then I started understanding what they were saying. The buzzing wasn't just noise, it was pure information flowing directly into my brain. I saw things, thousands of years worth of knowledge. The mountain was hollow inside, filled with endless chambers and tunnels. Millions of humans over the centuries had become part of this hive, all working together toward some purpose I couldn't quite grasp. My body started walking toward the nearest tree without me telling it to. The bark opened up like a door, revealing tunnels going down into the mountain. I could see others inside, people covered in insects, working on something. Building hexagonal chambers, laying eggs, completely transformed from human into something else. My hand moved on its own and grabbed my phone from my pocket. Somehow I managed to turn on the LED flashlight. The bright light caused the swarms to scatter for just a moment, and I regained control of my body. I ran. Insects poured from the holes in my skin as I moved, leaving a trail behind me. I made it to my car, started the engine, and drove straight to the nearest hospital. The doctors found 17 different species of insects inside me. Some of them were completely unknown to science, and all of them had these weird genetic markers that suggested hive behavior. They removed what they could, but some had burrowed too deep. I still have the honeycomb scars on my arm where they first broke through. Looking back now, I think I got out just in time. Whatever was happening in that valley, it was ancient and patient. It had been collecting people for centuries, turning them into parts of some massive collective mind. I never went back to finish my research. Hell, I never went back to that part of Kentucky at all. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear buzzing in the walls of my apartment. Just faint, like something far away trying to call me back. I tell myself it's just regular insects, maybe bees in the building's walls. But deep down, I know they're still out there, still waiting, still growing. I changed my major after that, switched to computer science, something as far from entomology as I could get. But I still think about those fireflies spelling out words in the darkness. Still wonder how many other people are driving through those mountains right now, thinking they're alone when they're really being watched, being chosen. I don't talk about this much, obviously. People think you're crazy when you tell them mountains can think, that insects can build civilizations. But I know what I saw. I know what was growing inside me. And I know that hive mind is still out there, patient as stone, waiting for the next researcher or hiker to wander too close to Black Creek. The scars on my arm itch sometimes, especially when it rains. That's when the buzzing in the walls gets loudest. I was 30 when I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail solo. Honestly, it wasn't some grand adventure plan or anything like that. I'd just gotten out of a pretty messy divorce, lost my job at the insurance company, and basically my whole life had fallen apart in the span of about 6 months. My buddy Jake suggested I take some time to clear my head, and hiking seemed like a good way to do that without spending money I didn't have. I'd done plenty of day hikes before, but never anything this long. The plan was to do a section from Georgia up through North Carolina, maybe Tennessee if I felt up to it. I'd been on the trail for about 2 weeks when I reached this area called Hunger Hollow. The name should have been a warning, honestly, but I figured it was just one of those historical names that didn't mean much anymore. You know how these old mountain places get their names from something that happened 100 years ago. I was tired, it was getting late, and the area looked perfect for camping. There was this grove of massive oak trees about 50 yards off the main trail, with trunks that had to be 15 feet around. They were old, probably been there since before anyone settled these mountains. I set up my tent right in the middle of the grove. The ground was level, soft, and the trees would give me good cover if it rained during the night. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. I got my little camp stove going and heated up some freeze-dried pasta for dinner. While I was eating, I started really looking at these trees for the first time. They were beautiful, don't get me wrong, but they had these weird growths on them. At first I thought they were burls, you know, those knobby growths you sometimes see on old trees. But the more I looked at them, the more they bothered me. These growths weren't round like normal burls. They were shaped wrong, kind of oval, and I had these lines running through them that looked almost like, well, like lips. Closed lips. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd been alone on the trail too long and my imagination was getting the better of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these things were looking at me somehow. I finished my dinner, cleaned up my gear, and settled into my tent around 10 o'clock. The forest was quiet, which felt normal at first. No owls, no insects, no wind in the trees, just silence. I was tired enough that I fell asleep pretty quickly, despite the weird feeling about those tree growths. I woke up around midnight to the sound of chewing, not like someone eating chips or something. This was wet, slobbering chewing, like an animal tearing into raw meat. And it was coming from every direction around my tent. I laid there for probably 10 minutes, trying to convince myself it was just some raccoons or maybe a bear that had found someone's leftover food. But the sound was too organized, too rhythmic, and there was too much of it. I unzipped my tent flap just enough to look out, and that's when I saw them. The tree growths had opened. They weren't burls at all. They were mouths. Actual mouths with bark lips and wooden teeth, and they were all eating. Birds, squirrels, anything that had been sleeping in the branches was being pulled into these mouths. I watched a blue jay get sucked right into one of the smaller mouths about 20 feet from my tent. The mouth closed around it, and I could hear the crunching. I thought I was losing my mind. I actually pinched myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. But the pain was real, and so was what I was seeing. One of the bigger trees had caught a deer somehow. Its roots had erupted from the ground and wrapped around the animal's legs, pulling it down toward the base of the trunk. The deer was screaming, this horrible sound I'd never heard before, while dozens of smaller root mouths fed on it. The roots weren't just holding it down, they were eating it alive. That's when I noticed the trees were secreting something. A thick, clear fluid was oozing from their bark, dripping down the trunks like sap. Except this wasn't sap. A few drops landed on my tent and immediately started eating through the fabric, hissing and smoking like acid. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just grabbed my stuff and bolted. But the trees were everywhere, and their branches started moving like arms, reaching for me as I ran past. The mouths were moaning now, this low rumble that I could feel in my chest. It shook the ground under my feet. Some of the trees had tongues. These rough, bark-covered tongues that extended 20 feet or more, whipping through the air like tentacles. One of them wrapped around my ankle, and the bark was covered in thorns that dug right through my hiking boots. It started pulling me toward a trunk that had a mouth big enough to swallow me whole. I could see inside that mouth as it dragged me closer. There were bones in there, camping gear, pieces of clothing, things that looked like they might have once been human. The throat went deep into the earth, and I could hear wet, digesting sounds coming from somewhere below. This thing was eating people, had been eating people for who knows how long. I managed to get my knife out and cut through the tongue. Black sap sprayed out everywhere, burning my skin where it touched. The entire grove screamed when I cut it. Every tree mouth opened at once and let out this sound like 100 wood chippers running at full speed. It was so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. The root system started erupting from the ground all around me, writhing like tentacles. That's when I realized these weren't separate trees at all. They were all connected underground, part of one massive organism. One giant hungry thing that had been pretending to be a grove of trees. The smaller mouth branches started detaching from the trees and crawling toward me like wooden spiders. They had tiny mouths too, chittering with needle-sharp teeth. I was kicking at them, trying to keep them away from my legs, but there were too many. The ground beneath me was getting soft, and I realized it wasn't dirt anymore. It was flesh. The entire forest floor was this thing's digestive system, camouflaged to look like normal earth. My boots were dissolving in the acidic soil flesh, and I could feel it starting to burn my feet. Trees that I thought were normal started revealing mouths too. Every tree for miles was part of this thing. It had always been part of it. I found other hikers' remains stuck in hollow sections of the trunks, partially digested but still recognizable. Some were still alive, fused into the bark, being slowly absorbed. They begged me to kill them, but they were part of the trees now. One was just a face in the bark, still conscious, still screaming. I couldn't help them. I couldn't even help myself. The trees started herding me toward the center of the grove. There was a tree there that was older than the rest, with a trunk that had to be 30 feet wide. Its mouth was already open, waiting for me. It was big as a garage door, and inside I could see hundreds of bones arranged in root chambers like some kind of sick collection. The mouth branches were pushing me toward it, chittering excitedly like they were looking forward to feeding time. I was maybe 20 feet away from that massive mouth when I remembered my camp stove fuel. I had a full canister in my pack. I sprayed that fuel on every tree I could reach and sparked my lighter. The whole grove went up at once. They screamed like animals when the fire hit them, this awful sound that wasn't quite human but close enough to make my skin crawl. The burning sap smelled like cooking meat mixed with rotting wood. I ran through the fire, trees still too, wrying to grab me even while they were burning. Branches covered in flames were reaching out, trying to pull me back into the inferno. It took me 3 hours to reach a road, running through the dark with my feet bloody and my boots completely gone. I flagged down a trucker who took one look at me and drove me straight to the hospital. When the Forest Service went out to investigate the next day, they said they found no evidence of any fire, no burned grove. Just normal oak trees growing in Hunger Hollow like they always had. But I know what I saw. I know what tried to eat me that night. And I know they're still out there, waiting with their mouths closed, looking like normal trees until some hiker decides to camp in the wrong spot. I never finished the Appalachian Trail, never went hiking alone again, to be honest. These days I stick to city parks where the trees are young and I can see other people around. Because sometimes when I'm walking past an old oak tree, I swear I can see lines in the bark that look just a little too much like closed lips. And I never, ever camp anywhere near a place called Hunger Hollow. I was 28 when I decided storm chasing was going to be more than just a weekend hobby. I'd been working tech support for a cable company in Asheville, but honestly, sitting in a cubicle all day was killing me. I had my amateur radio license, some decent weather tracking equipment I'd saved up for, and a pickup truck that could handle mountain roads. The plan was simple: follow severe weather systems through the Appalachians, document atmospheric conditions, maybe sell some footage to news stations. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat answering phone calls about broken cable boxes. The storm I was tracking that night in October was supposed to be a good one. Weather Service had issued warnings for most of western North Carolina. High winds, possible hail, the works. I'd been following it since it formed over Tennessee, and by evening it was moving through the mountains towards Sorrow Ridge. That's about as remote as you can get in these parts. Just logging roads and old family land that's been abandoned for decades. Perfect spot to set up my equipment without worrying about power lines or cell towers interfering with my readings. I got there around 8 o'clock, parked on a flat spot near the ridgeline where I had a clear view in all directions. The storm was still a few hours out, so I had plenty of time to set up my weather station, radio equipment, and laptop to log everything. The air had that heavy feeling you get before a big storm, thick and still, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. I'd chased enough systems to know that feeling well, but there was something different about this one. The usual sounds you hear in the mountains at night, owls, insects, small animals moving through the brush, they were all missing. Just complete silence except for the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. The storm hit around 10:30. Good strong winds, decent lightning show, but nothing too crazy. I got some solid readings on my equipment and managed to capture a few decent video clips of the lightning strikes. By 11, it had mostly passed through, leaving just the usual post-storm calm and the smell of rain on dry leaves. That's when things started getting weird. I was packing up my gear when my radio started picking up signals. Now, atmospheric conditions after storms can do strange things to radio waves, so at first I didn't think much of it. But this wasn't the usual static or distant stations bleeding through. There were patterns in the noise, rhythmic, almost like breathing. I adjusted the frequency, thinking maybe I was picking up some kind of interference from my other equipment. That's when I heard the voices. They were describing me. Not talking to me, but about me, like I was some kind of specimen they were observing. "Subject is adjusting the radio," one of them said in this flat, emotionless tone. "Subject is now concerned. Subject's heart rate increasing." The voice was human enough, but there was something wrong with it. Too precise, like someone reading from a script. I switched to a different frequency. Same voices, still talking about me. Subject is attempting to evade observation, they said. Subject cannot evade. I tried another frequency, then another. They were on every channel, describing my every movement in real time. Subject is using illumination device. We remain undetected. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the area. Nothing but trees and rocks, same as always. But the voices kept going, noting everything I did with that same clinical detachment. My equipment started acting up. The electromagnetic field detector I use for lightning research was showing readings that didn't make any sense. The needle was pegged at maximum, jumping around like it was picking up some mass. I have electrical field. The air itself felt different. Electric. You know that feeling you get right before lightning strikes nearby? That metallic taste in your mouth, the way your hair stands up? It was like that, but constant, getting stronger by the minute. Through the static, I heard them discussing my thoughts. Not just my actions now, but what I was thinking. Subject is considering leaving, they said. We must prevent this. That's when I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was happening, I needed to get out of there. My truck wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead. Not just low, but totally drained. The digital clock on the dashboard was blank. My cell phone was dead too. Even my flashlight was dimming, like whatever was causing this was sucking power from everything electronic around me. The voices laughed. It wasn't human laughter, more like the sound tuning forks make when they ring, overlapping and echoing off each other. I started seeing shapes moving at the edge of my vision, tall and thin, just outside the range of my dying flashlight. But every time I turned to look directly at them, there was nothing there. Subject cannot perceive us directly, the voices noted. Frequency mismatch. That's when they started talking about things from my past. Personal things. Details about my childhood, conversations I'd had with people, embarrassing moments from years ago that nobody else could possibly know. They described the time I broke my arm falling out of a tree when I was 8, word for word what my mother said to me in the hospital. They knew about the girl I had a crush on in high school, the job interview I bombed last spring, even what I'd had for breakfast that morning. The static on my radio was getting louder, and I started seeing them in it. When you tune between stations and get that white noise, that visual static on old TV screens, they were in there. Tall figures made of television snow, fuzzy and shifting, like they existed in the space between frequencies. One of them reached through my radio, its hand made of buzzy, snang interference, and touched my arm. Where it touched me, my skin became translucent. I could see my veins, my bones, but they looked wrong, like circuit boards instead of living tissue. Subject beginning integration into observation network, the voices said. My vision started breaking up like bad reception on an old TV. I could see myself from outside, from their perspective, and I realized there were hundreds of them surrounding me. We just couldn't see them normally because they existed in parts of the electromagnetic spectrum our eyes can't detect. They'd been there all along, maybe for decades, watching everyone, documenting everything, hiding in the white noise of our radios and televisions. I felt my body starting to move without my control. They were in my nervous system now, the electromagnetic field rewriting my neural pathways like reprogramming a computer. I could suddenly see everyone in the valley below, families in their homes, all being watched by these static beings, thousands of them, documenting every human action, every thought, every conversation. My mouth opened and static came out instead of screams. My thoughts were becoming frequencies, losing human language. I was becoming part of their observation network, just another antenna in their system for monitoring human behavior. That's when I remembered the emergency flare in my truck. With the last bit of control I had, I managed to grab it and pull the pin. The magnesium burn lit up the entire ridge, brilliant white light that seemed to disrupt whatever field was holding me. The static beings scattered like bad reception, clearing up when you adjust the antenna. My vision snapped back to normal, and I could control my body again. But I could still hear them in the static, angry now. Subject has damaged observation protocols, they said. Subject marked for retrieval. I ran, left all my equipment, all my expensive gear, and just ran down the logging road until I reached the main highway, flagged down a trucker, and convinced him to give me a ride back to town. The whole way, there, they followed me. Every radio in the truck, every electronic device we passed, I could hear them in the static between stations, discussing my retrieval status and debating whether to re-establish contact. I had to move to a cabin with no electricity to get away from them. Found a place way up in the mountains that's completely off-grid. No power lines, no cell towers, nothing electronic for miles. Sometimes during thunderstorms, I can still see them in the lightning. Tall figures made of electrical discharge, watching from the spaces between radio frequencies. I never went back for my equipment, never went storm chasing again. These days I work construction, something that keeps me outdoors and away from too much electronic equipment. I still have my amateur radio license, but I haven't touched a radio in 3 years. Every time I see static on a TV screen or hear white noise between stations, I wonder if they're still there, still watching, still documenting everything we do from their invisible observation posts scattered across the electromagnetic spectrum. Looking back now, I think they've been watching us a lot longer than we realize. Every piece of electronic equipment we use, every radio wave we broadcast, every cell phone call we make, we're constantly surrounded by their medium, their language. We just never knew how to see them before. The scary part isn't that they're watching us. The scary part is wondering what they're going to do with all that information they've been collecting.